Welcome to another episode of Inside Xi's China, the Great Gameplan. In this episode, we will focus on China's Belt and Road Initiative, which was central to its designs to conquer the world. In 2013, China claimed that it will retrace the ancient Silk Route and decided to build belts and roads around the world. But all roads led towards one goal. It was to aid China's rise as the new age hegemon. In the garb of providing loans for mega projects, the scheme aimed to gain access to strategic infrastructure to control both land and sea. But that wasn't all. Countries that didn't sign up for the BRI were arm twisted in a whole different way. How much has Xi Jinping succeeded in his plan? Find out in this episode. From Laos in Asia to Venezuela in Latin America, and from Hungary in Europe to Angola in Africa, the BRI now spans 139 countries around the world, with notable exceptions like India. The BRI is the story of Chinese economic expansionism and debt diplomacy. In Asia, the Hambantota port exemplifies this. The port shows how reckless acceptance of Chinese loans compromised sovereignty of key assets for small countries like Sri Lanka. China created a debt mountain for Sri Lanka by giving more loans which were used to repay interest of the previous loans. Finally, China offered to rescue the island nation from its unsustainable debt burden. And as per the relief package, Colombo was required to sign a 99-year lease for the port to China Merchant Port Holdings and 15,000 acres surrounding it.
China has conducted sort of debt for equity swaps, and this hasn't taken place very often, but it has occurred a few times, which allows Chinese firms to acquire equity stakes in infrastructure projects that Chinese banks has helped to finance. And a good example of this occurred in 2016, I believe, when you had a debt for equity swap allowed the Chinese state-owned enterprise China Merchant Group to purchase an 85% stake in the concession that operates the Hambantota port. And so this is a tool that the Chinese Communist Party uses, the party state uses, in order to push forward a number of their national security interests, which we've seen them use in a number of other cases as well.
But China's Lankan expansion did not stop at the Hambantota port. It began work on a new port city, which was supposed to be Dubai and Hong Kong all rolled into one. Located in downtown Colombo, the project could be China's biggest enclave. Another Asian country with poor investment rating that got truckloads of Chinese funds was Pakistan. Xi Jinping made Pakistan-occupied Kashmir the very fulcrum of his connectivity plan, linking China to the Gwadar port in Balochistan. Through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, China pursued both its economic and geopolitical objectives. The CPEC offered an alternative route for China's energy imports from West Asia and the possibility to amplify India's national security threats by colluding with Pakistani security apparatus. For this, Xi Jinping green-lighted risky projects in restive regions like Balochistan and Sindh and poured over $50 billion in Pakistan. Since BRI thrives at the cross-section of China's lopsided loans and compromised political leadership of recipient nations, successive Pakistani governments made merry. This model also worked in the Maldives, where China loaned heavily in projects that were fundamentally unsustainable, including an alternative port that costed billions of dollars, and the Maldives-China Friendship Bridge, a loan that Maldivian leaders felt they just couldn't repay even after selling their family silver. Since India has deep cultural, historical links with Maldives, China again used its money power to build political linkages to sideline New Delhi. Incidentally, China did not even have an embassy in Malé till 2011. But once Maldives began encashing those Chinese checks, China became its largest lender in just 6 years. In Europe, China tightened its grip enough for the EU to undermine its position as the champion of human rights and values. Between 2010 and 2019, Chinese companies gained ownership of 4 airports, including the Frankfurt-Hahn Airport in Germany, 6 ports, and a dozen professional soccer clubs. And as Europe deepened its reliance on Chinese money, it found its very own Hambantota, a financially unviable infrastructure project in a country located on a vital sea route. It was the 350-kilometer rail line connecting Belgrade in Serbia and Budapest in Hungary. The rail project is one of the most expensive infrastructure in Europe and in Hungary. Serbian and Hungarian politicians cheered the arrival of large Chinese funds, but the countries were in no position to service the loan. The railway line connected Europe with the Greek port of Piraeus, another asset on a key sea route that the Chinese controlled since 2013. The rail network was China's gateway to enter the European market. In exchange for loans, China gained enormous clout on the European continent, and this clout came in handy at crucial geopolitical events. China's island-building activity in the Indo-Pacific and the appalling human rights record of the CCP did not elicit a response from the EU, as several member nations had enormous exposure to China. Hungary and Greece were 2 such examples.
It's a failure not only by these states, it's also a failure of the European Union. If we have a policy to become more economically independent and not rely on non-democracies, we also need to give them alternatives. I think so. This is a time for Europe maybe to stand up a bit more and offer these alternatives, and not only in Europe, but maybe also in our close neighborhood.
But China's real success came when a G7 country endorsed its neopolitical tactics. On the 23rd of March 2019, Rome stunned the world by joining Xi Jinping's connectivity plan. Just like a heavily indebted Athens found Chinese offers too good to resist, Rome, with a debt-GDP ratio of 135%, hoped the BRI would lift its economy out of its sub-0.5% growth levels.
You look at Poland and the Czech Republic that expected enormous investment into Europe, very little actually came in. I mean, the investment is to the more advanced economies, Germany, Sweden, France, and of course, which is no longer a European country, but UK. So what we see is that the focus of China has been on the more advanced economies.
As per data from the Rhodium Group, between 2000 and 2019, China invested 50 billion euros in UK. Less than half of it, that is about 22 billion euros, went to Germany. Italy and France received 15.9 billion and 14.4 billion euros respectively. Unlike Europe, Asia and Latin America, where China sought ownership of vital sea routes, in Africa, Xi Jinping chased precious resources. In Africa, Beijing's template was fairly simple: hunt for lucrative assets and identify countries with weak political systems. The continent was ripe for Chinese funds due to political instability and governance failure, and of course, acute fund shortage. Since 2014, Chinese investments have outpaced American investments in Africa. China invested $43 billion in 2021, compared to $40 billion by the US. The consistently high Chinese investments ensured Chinese monopoly over precious metals like cobalt that are essential to make phones and batteries. 2/3 of cobalt mines are now in Central African country of DRC. 8 of the 14 large cobalt mines in the DRC are now run by Chinese companies. Another example of unchecked Chinese inflows is Angola, Africa's second largest oil producer. Angola received a third of the total Chinese loans on the entire African continent. This was largely through the barter oil deals for loan transactions with China. Within 2 years, Angola did not have enough oil to sell in the open market. Through BRI, China invested anywhere between $1 to $1.5 trillion over a 9-year period. Exact estimates are hard to come by due to China's opaqueness. The scheme gave loans to nations hungry for good quality infrastructure. But the money was too expensive and went largely in unviable projects. This made repayment unlikely and resulted in growing indebtedness towards China. This was debt diplomacy, a foreign policy tool that allowed China to gain enormous control over a country due to its vast exposure to China.
Debt diplomacy is an important part of China's sort of Belt and Road Initiative, which is this foreign policy initiative under Xi Jinping to sort of establish China through use of infrastructure investment and debt and developing business relationships with China as sort of a centerpiece of that. And I think that debt diplomacy has become sort of one of a number of tools for China to sort of push forward the Belt and Road Initiative.
BRI became the cornerstone of CCP's game plan to conquer the world. It was launched amidst much fanfare in September 2013 by Xi Jinping in Kazakhstan and Indonesia. But what began as an effort to connect Europe and Asia via roads and ports soon transformed into technology, outer space, and even connecting the Arctic Circle. And so came the Digital Silk Road, the Space Information Corridor, and the Polar Silk Road. China announced an alternate route to Europe through the Arctic Circle in 2017, despite not being a claimant country in the Arctic region. Strategically, a shorter distance via the Arctic meant faster travel, not just for goods, but also for intercontinental ballistic missiles. The distance from Shanghai to New York is 11,800 kilometers. This could be reduced by 60% if the missiles travel from the North Pole to New York. The Digital Silk Road was a plan to link 75 countries through the undersea cable network for seamless flow of information. In theory, this was utopian. In reality, it meant China could have access to vast quantities of data. At its disposal would be individual records to submarine data of countries. Within 4 years of its launch, BRI was enshrined in China's constitution. It gave a glimpse of how Xi Jinping envisioned China's role in the 21st century, that of a modern-day colonizer, building leverage over weaker countries. Strategically located nations like Greece and Pakistan that became gateways to Europe and Middle East made the cut early on. Spread over 6 economic corridors, BRI was a giant web of bilateral engagements. The projects were designed, funded, and executed only to further the interest of Chinese companies. Unlike multilateral projects, where 40% work is typically executed by local contractors, under BRI, 90% work was done by Chinese companies for Chinese contractors, who in turn employed only Chinese workers. This meant that instead of becoming a game changer for recipient nations, China's loans only spruced up Chinese economy by way of large contracts. Recipient nations were left with a large debt pile and excessive Chinese hold over their national interest. At its core, BRI was an elaborate money-lending exercise. China borrowed cheaply from World Bank and charged much higher interest rates from recipient nations. Nations joined the BRI bandwagon without reading the fine print of Chinese loans. China charged as high as 6.2% interest rates on project finance. At these rates, a $500 million loan doubled to $930 million in just a decade. Worse still, payments began in just 10 years, even though large-scale infrastructure projects have a gestation of about 30 to 40 years. Compare that to Japan, which is Asia's biggest infra financer. Tokyo charges sub 0.5 interest rates over a 40-year period. Apart from being unfair, the scheme addressed just 4% of Asia's infrastructure needs. But China's PR machinery turned it into a once-in-a-generation opportunity for fund-starved countries. State media even drowned the fact that Japan invested $230 billion between 2000 and 2018, as against China's investments of just $155 billion. But perhaps the most appealing part of China's checks was that it came with no requirement for either democracy or transparency. Unlike Western grants, which required transparency, China's funds came with no strings attached and were particularly appealing to despots and authoritarian leaders. But unlike funding from other sources, China's checks threatened to turn several countries into vassal states due to their high indebtedness. From Greece to Hungary to Pakistan, all handed out infrastructure located at important locations to Chinese companies. Ports, railway lines, power stations, all of it. Total debt to countries under the BRI program could be close to $190 billion, almost as much as they owe to World Bank. Between 2005 and 2017, 29 economies rated below the investment grade and 14 economies with no rating at all received lion's share of China's loans. These economies received $254 billion out of the total investment of $420 billion. But it was not just about big loans. China has by design not joined the Paris Club, which is an informal group of most large economies that give concessional loans and grants. The Paris Club ensures multilateral loans are transparent and not exploitative, allowing the recipient countries to repay without excessive burden. Due to China's decision to only have an observer status in the Paris Club, it does not have to follow any standards while issuing BRI loans. This makes these loans both opaque and unfair. Even for nations that were not sold on to China's never-ending loans, masquerading as investments, they continued to face Beijing's economic warfare. As an economic bully, China has used its economic heft to cause irreparable damage to smaller economies. For geopolitical gains and to ingrain its diplomatic view, China's unwritten trade code is clear. It will always use its economic superiority to further its political objectives. But other nations should stay away from following the same practice. Instead, China's trade partners were expected to de-link their economic ties with their political views. For the CCP, though, its economic and geopolitical objectives are two sides of the same coin. In 2010, Liu Xiaobo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his campaign against the CCP. What followed was a complete mockery of global trade norms and breakdown of international trade practices. It showed how blurred the lines between trade and politics and foreign policy were in Chinese statecraft. Norway's market share of salmon exports to China plummeted from 92% in 2010 to 29% by mid-2013 after Beijing imposed strict measures targeting Oslo. Bilateral trade pact between the two countries also fell apart after China took exception to the peace prize to Xiaobo. Other smaller economies like Mongolia, South Korea, Taiwan have also been at the receiving end of China's trade reprisals. These countries were hit significantly because China weaponized its economic superpower. A 2010 study found that countries whose leaders met the Dalai Lama suffered a rapid decline in their exports to China, with the result that most of them have now been forced to shun any contact with the Tibetan spiritual leader. Over time, Chinese aggressive trade practices have been normalized since smaller economies are not able to cushion the severe economic blow due to these repeated trade reprisals. In the Indo-Pacific, China bullied its neighbor South Korea after the deployment of the missile defense system THAAD. Seoul, as a security ally of America, is entitled to keep American defense equipment on its soil. But soon after the deployment, China boycotted South Korean goods. This resulted in losses to the tune of $7.5 billion. China relented only after the then South Korean President Moon Jae-in declared the three no's, which was no further deployment of THAAD, no agreement to join the US missile system, and no to a joint military pact with US and Japan. Economic warfare ran parallel to China's military aggression to reclaim the disputed islands in the region. For China, its economic strength is a means to an end, which was to control the world. It helped that everyone played along. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres even linked the BRI to the Millennium Development Goals. He said, even as BRI evoked strong protests from locals, like in Kazakhstan, where protests broke out regarding a proposed change in land law that would have allowed Chinese companies to play a larger role in agriculture. Violent protests and calls for boycotts forced the government to keep Chinese agricultural companies outside of agriculture. It took a global pandemic, which originated in China, for the world to finally see through the economic warfare that China unleashes on the world. Xi Jinping may have been exposed, but the scheme continues. And worse still, the world is grappling to find alternatives to BRI. It's easy to blame the smaller nations that fell into the debt trap, but it's more important to provide alternatives and other sources of funding. It's not enough to expect China to play by the rules.
China has its Belt and Road Initiative, and we think that there's a much more equitable way to provide for the needs of countries around the world. And so it's a values-driven, high-standard, transparent financing mechanism we're going to provide.
What's needed is an alternative mechanism to help nations in dire need of funds. Till then, the BRI will continue to find takers. It's unclear if the CCP's objective of completion of projects by 2049 will be met. But what's clear, economic aggression by China as a means to conquer the world will continue.